Welcome back to the Balancing Act podcast. I'm Andy Temte. On the Balancing Act, we talk to business leaders and industry experts to explore the balancing acts we play in our professional lives and learn about the events that put rocket boosters behind their career success. Today, we have Tyler Shultz joining us. Tyler is a keynote speaker, a venture partner at Verge HealthTech Fund, an advisory board member at the Signals Network. He's a former CEO and founder of Flux Biosciences and was a research engineer and whistleblower at Theranos. Also, fun fact, he's a fairly new dad, so we're going to celebrate new dad energy on the show today. Welcome to the show, Tyler.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
That's nice. So Tyler, before we get started, I ask all my guests this question. Please tell our listeners the elevator pitch version of your story, with the recognition that we'll get into Theranos quite a bit later in the show.
Right. So going a bit broader than just the Theranos experience, I was born and raised in Los Gatos, California, in the Bay Area, not too far from Stanford. My dad was a high school biology teacher. My mom was a nurse and then became a stay-home parent when my brother was born, my younger brother. And actually, my dad was my high school biology teacher, I should add, which was pretty fun. Wow. You know, freshman year, coming to high school, there's my dad. Had a really, it was a very interesting experience being able to see your dad in his place of work. And luckily, he was a well-liked teacher, so everything went well. And after high school, I went to Stanford University, where I ended up majoring in biology. After that, my first job out of college was at Theranos. And, we'll get into that more later. But after Theranos, I worked in a lab at Stanford for about 3 years on a next generation type diagnostic device that I ended up spinning out into the startup Flux Biosciences. Unfortunately, that company didn't work out, but I immediately started another company called Healthier, which still does exist, but I no longer work at it. When my son was born, it just felt like it was a good time to step away and spend more time with my family. And I went from full-time founder mode to full-time dad mode pretty much overnight. And it was an awesome decision.
That's great. So you're in biology class in high school. Your dad is in the front of the class. What did the other students think of that dynamic? Were they like rolling their eyes? Oh, Tyler's going to get all the preferential treatment.
I didn't really sense that much at all, to be honest. If anything, I think my dad was harder on me than he was on other students. I think definitely when it came to grading, he was harder. I think he made a very concerted effort to not show any preferential treatment. So I don't think I got that sense from any of my classmates.
Yeah, my dad's cousin was my calculus teacher at my alma mater, and boy, did he give he gave me a really hard time. I got out of that class luckily with a C.
Wow!
It was pretty rough. He was going to make a point to the other students that there was no preferential treatment here.
Yeah, better that than the inverse, I think.
That's right. So, Tyler, if you could pick one event in your life that just put rocket boosters behind your career and where you are today, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think the obvious answer would be my experiences at Theranos. But since we're going to talk about that a bit later, I'm going to move on to something else. And when I think back about like one experience that really put rocket boosters behind my career, I think about the X Prize competition that I participated in when I was a researcher at Stanford. And the X Prize basically put up this big prize purse of $10 million to any team, whether that be an industry team or an academic team that could diagnose, I think it was like 12 different diseases with one device that weighed less than 5 pounds. And because they put up that prize purse and kind of formalized a competition around it, it really gave our lab an excuse to spend a lot of money, a lot being, a lot for academics, I would say, right. More on like the productization of the technology that we had been working on, as opposed to what academia typically does is more like fundamental research. So it kind of shifted the types of problems we were trying to solve. And then we did win an award in that competition that was not $10 million, but it was a small, modest cash prize that we could use as momentum to kind of spin this out into a startup. So I think that I think like many things in my life, there was an opportunity that presented itself, and I did my absolute best to make the most of that opportunity. And really, that small opportunity has certainly snowballed into really the rest of my career.
Yeah, that's great. If you're not moving, you're standing still. Reach out, enter competitions. That sounds like that was a lot of fun. Tyler, let's dive into Theranos. I'm very familiar with the story. Many of our listeners will not be familiar with what transpired at Theranos. Can you give us just a bit of background on the rise and fall of Theranos?
Sure. So to kind of give some context about what Theranos was, I can actually tell you about the first time I ever met its founder and CEO, Elizabeth Holmes. And I met her in my grandfather's living room because my grandfather lived and worked on the Stanford campus where I was attending college at the time. And Elizabeth essentially laid out this vision to us. And she said that after she dropped out of Stanford when she was 19, she invented this revolutionary technology in her uncle's basement that could do anything that a central laboratory could do, but with just a single drop of blood. And what was even more impressive than that was that you could do these tests essentially anywhere where you had access to electricity. So you could run these tests in medevac helicopters or operating rooms or patients' homes or Walgreens and Safeways. It seemed like a technology that had absolutely no limitations. And she was able to put together one of the most high-profile boards, I think, in probably U.S. history, honestly, and assembled really high-profile investors as well. Ended up attaining a $9 billion valuation. She was the youngest self-made female billionaire. She was on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and Inc. Mm-hmm. And it was, again, my first job out of college. And it took maybe, it didn't take much time at all to realize that this was essentially a complete fraud. And so I did my best to expose this. And long story short, Elizabeth and her COO, president, and boyfriend, Sunny Balwani, are currently sitting in federal prison.
Yeah. So you got to watch out for COO, president, boyfriend.
Yeah. The man, I cut it short too. The man wore a lot of hats. He was the COO, president, boyfriend, investor, and board member. So wow. Talk about a man with conflicts of interest.
Yeah. Wow. So the main point of our conversation today is centers around the skill of courage. So that, just for our listeners to kind of set the baseline here. Let's talk about your experience at Theranos. If you can clue us into your personal journey, how you navigated from the beginnings of those kind of uncomfortable feelings, something's not quite right here, that feeling we get in our gut to, wow, this is really messed up and I got to say something. And then to actually committing and speaking out. Can you give us a sense of what that journey was like?
Sure. So the first time that I felt like, something's not quite right here was actually on my very first day as a full-time employee. So it did not take long at all. I happened to join the company the day that they launched the product. They had been in stealth mode for 11 years. And technically the day before I joined the company full-time, Elizabeth did the ribbon cutting ceremony at the first Walgreens in Palo Alto that would offer the test. They changed the website to actually say what they were doing. So it was very exciting. And what we were advertising was that we could do hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood. But on my first day, I learned that even though we had just launched the product, we had 0 tests that were validated on that Theranos platform, which means if a patient went into Walgreens that day, they would not get a finger prick, they would get a needle in the arm, and then 0 tests, none, would be run on the Theranos product. They would either be run on third-party equipment, or we would just send the blood samples to other labs. So that was the first indication.
Wow. Okay.
But again, this is my first day and I was 22 years old. Yeah, I was 22 years old and it was my first job out of college. And I only had an undergrad degree. I felt like I have to be missing something here, right?
Right.
I have to be missing something. And so that's why it was just that gut feeling, but I hadn't fully come to realize, how big of a fraud this really was. the next big red flags were when we were deceiving regulators. And I don't have to go into the details really, but it was pretty obvious to me that we were telling regulators one thing and actually doing something completely different. And even going as far as to locking the doors to the lab that had the Theranos product in it when inspectors came to look at our lab. So to me, it was pretty obvious, like, we're deceiving regulators here. But again, I don't have a lot of experience in the field. I still felt like I could be missing something. Maybe there's some locked door somewhere that has the real technology that will be unveiled to me that I'm not privy to. Right. But then when I got the feeling that I really have to start speaking up more, I have to do more, is when it became completely obvious that we were actively hurting people. And that became clear in a number of ways. One of which was when we validated a test for syphilis. And we were telling, samples that were syphilis positive, that they were negative. We tested ourselves and our colleagues for syphilis, and we were testing positive. So it was just clearly not working. And we sent all of the data to the statistics team, and to my absolute shock, it passed the validation criteria, and a medical doctor signed off on the validation report and said, we are going to start testing real patients for syphilis. And being the employee that actually, studied that test and validated that test, I knew with 100% certainty that it did not work, and that we were going to hurt people, and that something I directly contributed to was going to be hurting people.
Right. Wow.
And yeah, so that's when I felt like I really need to start doing more here. And so I talked to my colleagues and made sure that I wasn't missing something, that I wasn't the crazy one. And what was amazing was that everyone was seeing and thinking the exact same things, and no one was saying anything.
Right.
No one was willing to speak up.
Yep. Yep.
And that wasn't without good reason. Over the course of over a decade, Elizabeth and Sunny had intentionally built this culture of fear, where if people spoke up, they were fired. There were locked doors, there were barricades, there were silos. You were told not to talk to your coworkers about work. People had like Post-it notes over their webcams because they thought that Sunny was watching them through their laptops. And then sometimes after they fired employees, they would also sue them. And when they sued employees, they would send out company-wide emails about it. And if you read between the lines, those emails essentially said, we will sue you too if you get in our way.
Right.
And so people stopped speaking up. And in biochemistry, we have this great phrase that goes, you get what you screen for. And the idea is that you have complete control over your experiment, but sometimes, unexpected things still happen. And so you really need to be intentional about the cultures that you build and the environment that you create. And I think Elizabeth and Sunny really understood that, and they created an environment where no one was going to get in their way. No one was going to speak up.
Yeah. Yeah, that I'm glad that you used the F word, the fear word, because being courageous in the workplace, it's hard enough when you're in a collaborative environment that is not fear-based. But oh my goodness, when you have fear-based management sitting and pressing down on top of you, that is really, really hard. Tyler, courage is one of the most important life and career skills that an individual can develop. And I'm just really excited about, folks learning from you today. Most of us are conflict avoiders, right? Most of us are those people that you're working with that didn't want to say anything because they felt threatened. They felt like they didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, so why speak up? What advice do you have for listeners who struggle with speaking out? How can you help coach a conflict avoider to find their voice?
So I think one thing that most people can do, something that I certainly did well, was I tried to prove myself wrong. And in doing so, you build a tremendous amount of confidence. I genuinely wanted to be wrong, to be honest. Like, I wanted to prove myself wrong. So I went and I looked behind every door, every barricade, talked to any ear that would be willing to listen to try to prove myself wrong. I even contacted regulators. I read CLIA laws. Like, I knew I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand regulations, but it's all publicly available. So I'm going to go read. I'm going to educate myself. And once I couldn't prove myself wrong, I knew with 100% certainty that no one else was going to be able to. I had complete confidence in myself. And that was an extremely important step for me because of the extreme bullying, threatening, and gaslighting that they did to me when I was trying to expose this. And when they tried to make me feel like I was stupid, like I was wrong, like I didn't know what I was talking about, I knew that I was right with 100% certainty. And if it was 99%, I think I would have folded. It needed to be 100%. And so I think that's one thing that people could do well if they're thinking about speaking up. But the other thing I would suggest is also just practicing on the small stuff. And I think in our lives, if you start looking for it, you'll see transgressions all the time. And most of the time we don't say anything. And so going through this routine of identifying when your values are being affronted and deciding when it's appropriate to do something about it and how you go about doing that. And by starting small and building up, you can really, I think, work out, like flex this ethical, courageous muscle that you're going to need when the big one, when the Theranos comes along.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that balancing act right after a quick commercial break. Hey, it's Andy here. I've got a new podcast I'd like to introduce you to, The Saturday Morning Muse. Start your weekend with me by exploring topics that span leadership, business management, education, and other musings that are designed to support your journey of personal and professional continuous improvement. Subscribe today on your favorite podcast platform. And we're back with Tyler Shultz talking about courage, finding your voice, and the world of healthcare startups. Tyler, courage and constructive conflict, they go hand in hand. And there's, as we were talking about, alluded to before the break, there's a balance to be struck between speaking out too much and being labeled the complainer in the office. And we all know who that is in our office, and we all kind of know what we say to ourselves about them. And then balanced against being not saying enough and being labeled a pushover. How have you navigated that balancing act in your career, especially at Theranos?
So I think personally, I am generally a pretty easygoing, laid-back person. I'm not known as being a complainer. And in a lot of ways, I think that worked to my advantage because even going back to when I was a young kid, like things that I don't even remember that my parents will bring up, they'd say like I was an easygoing kid until there was a line. And then it was like once that line was hit that I wasn't going to do, I was incredibly stubborn. So I think that there is like you have to find that line for yourself. You don't want to be the complainer. And you do have to pick your battles. And figuring out how to do that can be very challenging. Because you also don't, as you said, you don't want to be a pushover. You don't want to let things go. For me, I think it comes down to knowing what my own values are. And when something bothers me and asking myself, well, is this something minor that I can let go? Or is this a true like a conflict of my values? And those are the things that I really want to put my weight behind, that I will be stubborn about, that I will make sure I speak up about. And most other things, I pretty much I learned to live with it. I'm an easygoing person. Maybe it's something that I can fix myself. It's a little bit hard without talking about like a specific example, but I think for most things, I'm able to kind of let it go, and not raise a big fuss about it until there's something that I think is very important. And then I'm absolutely stubborn. For me, it's almost like a switch. It's like, I'm laid back until I'm not.
Yeah. Well, this is a really important concept because I've developed a personal planning guidebook. I'm teaching students at my alma mater and local university, a course based on my second book. And I specifically have them go through my personal planning guidebook. And when we talk about the results, I ask them a question that most of them have never contemplated before, which is, what are your red lines? What are when you're pushed, when are you going to stand up for yourself, and how do you relate that back to your purpose, your vision for yourself, the value set that you've created for yourself? In your life, in the arc of your life, when did you figure out that you had those red lines? Was that developed in your family? Was that something you did yourself? Because I'm telling you, a lot of people don't do that work.
Mm-hmm. So I do think what you're explaining is very, very important, because people don't wake up one day and decide to commit $1 billion fraud. It happens slowly over time. It's this moral slippage that can happen literally over a period of a decade, like it did with Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And it is important to draw those lines. I'm willing to tolerate up to this point, and then absolutely no more. I will not go any further. For me, a lot of it has come, I think, fairly intuitively. I didn't really go through that exercise actually until after my experiences at Theranos. So at Theranos, I think it all came pretty intuitively to me, or it was just so far across that red line that it was fairly obvious. Yeah. It was clearly not gray zone anymore.
Right.
It wasn't until I was a founder where I feel like the gray zone got a lot bigger, and I had to kind of define some boundaries for myself, things that I was not willing to do, things that I was willing to do, which became very challenging because I almost hate to say this, but I've been given, I think, a lot of bad advice as a founder. And one thing that I've heard several times actually is that I need to be more like Elizabeth Holmes, which I think is terrible advice, but is the type of advice that is probably given to a lot of founders, not just me.
Yeah. Tyler, we have to live with duplicity. There are, especially as a founder, especially as a leader, there are things that we can say to our people, and there are things that we can't say because we're in the middle of a funding round, or we're going to merge with this other company, and there is private information, I really appreciate the work that you're doing on the ethical front, and I can hear a baby in the background. That is awesome.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't apologize. Again, we're talking strong dad energy here.
Yeah.
But thank you for really shining a light on that, because that's what we're talking about here. Is you will have gray lines. You will have those areas where you have to be somewhat duplicitous with your team. But then, where is the red line? What don't you cross? So thank you for that.
Right. And I think it's important for anyone, but I think it is especially important for founders to just define that line ahead of time, not when you're in the middle of some dilemma. And so that's the worst time to decide where your red lines are, is when you're right up against it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, Tyler, what have we missed in our conversation that you'd like listeners to know about becoming more constructively courageous?
Yeah, I think I still have a number of thoughts. So one, to kind of combat this idea of being a complainer, I think one thing you can do is really build trust within your organization and show that you're dedicated to the organization. And even when you come with complaints, to also come with potential solutions. So you don't want to be the one who's just constantly calling out problems, but don't have any ideas on how to solve them. Mm-hmm. But if you come with problems, if you identify problems, but also come with ideas for how to solve them, then it shows that you really are on the same team, that you're dedicated to the vision of the company, and you're just trying to make sure that it's on the right path. I think that's how you go about kind of confronting potential issues while still showing that you're on the same team. So that's something I would really advise doing. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was you should notice when you're being personally attacked versus when your ideas are being attacked. And for me, when I came to Elizabeth with a lot of my concerns in an email, the boyfriend, COO, president, investor, board member responded to the email. And in that email, later, a Wall Street Journal reporter describes this email as dripping with venom, which is a great way to describe it. And he essentially called me arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless, and I had no understanding of basic math, science, or statistics. Right. And that's something that they kept going back to. They kept saying, "You're stupid, you don't understand. You're stupid. You don't understand. You don't have a PhD. Maybe if you had a PhD, you would get what we're doing here. And that's also part of their gaslighting, is like, we have much smarter people here who know what they're doing, and you don't know what you're doing. And my point was always, intelligence actually has nothing to do with anything here. I could be stupid, but I could still be right. And when they start attacking you personally and not the actual content of your complaints, that's when you know you're right, I think. Because they can't combat the actual content of your complaint. All they can do is call you stupid, call you a complainer, call you a whiner, call you young, ignorant, arrogant, reckless, etc. Yeah. And at the time, that can be very scary. That can push you into a corner. That can silence you. Yeah. But really, that should be your signal to do more, to speak up, to keep going.
That's great advice. So let's move beyond Theranos. You've started 2 companies, Flux Biosciences and now Healthier. What's one lesson that you've learned as a founder that you'd like to pass on to other founders today?
So one lesson that I'm sure founders have always heard, but I feel like you don't truly internalize it until you've experienced it, is that the people matter so much. The people matter so much more than really anything else at your company. But I think the one piece of bad advice that have been given is that your founder should be the type of person you could go out with a beer with and, be very friendly with, that you're comfortable spending a lot of time with. I think that's actually bad advice. You want a founder that you can go to war with, someone who you can fight with, but you can still respect. And it's easy to have a co-founder at the beginning when everyone is optimistic and maybe new money is coming in. It is much, much, much harder to keep a team together when money is running out, when you are losing traction. And those are the moments where you need someone to really have your back. And so when I would go about picking a co-founder, my advice to people going about picking a co-founder is to find that person.
Yeah. Well, also excellent advice. Let's close out the show with some lightning round questions. So quick answers, but question number 1, if I asked you to define your purpose, why you exist, what would that be?
That is such a tough question. I don't know how that's in the lightning round section.
But, well, some people have it and others don't.
Yeah. For me right now, I feel like my purpose in life is to be an amazing dad. Genuinely, right now, I'm kind of constructing my life to optimize the life that I can have with my family. And one of the things that I told my wife before our son was born was that since I graduated from college, I just been moving from stressful situation to stressful situation. And I just needed a moment to step back and breathe and be with my family. And I've started to kind of reconstruct my life around being the best dad that I can possibly be. So that's my answer right now is just being a great father and husband.
Well, there's a lot underneath being a great father and husband, and I wish you all the best there. My second question is my time machine question. You can send a message to an earlier version of Tyler Shultz. What's the message, and what previous version of yourself do you send it to?
I would send a message back to myself when I was at Theranos, and all I would say is, you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
Even though I always had 100% confidence that I was right, I did not have 100% confidence that I would win, that that Elizabeth and Sonny would go to prison, that my life wouldn't be ruined. And it would have given me tremendous relief if I could just have gotten a message from my future self that just said, you're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, we live in this world where you can construct alternative realities, and folks buy into them, and critical thinking and rational thought just flies out the window. So I definitely see that as a risk. Tyler,
I'll quickly add that a message I would not send would be to not do it. I would not tell my former self to not do what I was doing. Both because we ended up getting the outcome we were looking for, so it was worth it. But also because I know my former self would not have listened.
Yeah.
Even if my future self said, don't do this, stand down, knowing myself and knowing that the mindset I was in back then, I would have ignored advice from myself. I would have said, absolutely not. I'm going for this.
Awesome. Tyler, we're all works in progress. Other than being a fantastic dad, what are you focused on right now in your personal journey of growth?
Right now, I'm very focused on turning what has been the most negative experience of my life into a positive one. And joining podcasts like this is one great way to do that. I'm also being more intentional about speaking about my experiences at Theranos and trying to communicate the lessons from that experience to all the various stakeholders. So that's kind of where I'm at in my own personal growth, is, not holding on to anger or resentment or whatever I could be holding on to from this experience, but genuinely trying to turn it into a positive one.
Good. Well, if folks might be looking for you as a speaker to come in with your wonderful message, how do folks get a hold of you?
The best way would just be to go to my website, tyler-shultz.com. Hopefully we can just pop a link in the description to this podcast, make it really easy.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. Tyler, it was fantastic to meet you and spend time with you today. Really appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great.
All right. Well, my name is Andy Temte. This is the Balancing Act podcast. You can find us on all the major streaming services as well as out on YouTube. Please like, subscribe, rate, and most importantly, share this public good with your friends and your colleagues, especially today's message about courage in the workplace. Our show is produced by Nicholas Temte, and we'll see you next time on the Balancing Act.